2013, a paper was published in the journal Science that made a claim so specific and so uncomfortable that many people who read it assumed it had to be wrong. The claim was this: when a person is preoccupied with a serious financial problem, the cognitive capacity available to them for every other task they face drops by the equivalent of 13 IQ points. Not motivation, not confidence, not willpower. Cognitive capacity. The raw processing power of the human mind, measured through standard tests of fluid intelligence and working memory, declines by a measurable, significant, and consistent amount in people who are financially stressed, compared to the same people when that stress is absent. 13 points is not a small number. 13 points is the difference between a well-rested adult and someone who has not slept in 36 hours. It is the cognitive impairment level associated with being clinically drunk. It is, for context, almost exactly the full-scale IQ gap that researchers observe between groups at opposite ends of most standardized educational testing distributions. And the researchers who found it did not find it in a lab under artificial conditions. They found it in a sugarcane field in India, in a shopping mall in New Jersey, and eventually in studies replicated across 4 continents, with results consistent enough that the finding has now entered mainstream cognitive science, behavioral economics, and poverty research as one of the most structurally important discoveries of the last 2 decades. The researchers were Sendhil Mullainathan, an economist at Harvard, and Eldar Shafir, a psychologist at Princeton. Their framework has a name. They call it the scarcity trap. And once you understand the mechanism behind it, you cannot look at financial struggle, financial behavior, or your own relationship with money in quite the same way again. The story begins not with economics, but with a question that Mullainathan had been sitting with for years in his work on poverty. Something about the standard explanation of why poor people sometimes make decisions that seem, from the outside, financially counterproductive, had never fully satisfied him. The conventional explanation was essentially motivational. People in poverty make poor financial decisions because they lack financial literacy, or because poverty creates a culture of short-term thinking, or because years of hardship produce a kind of learned helplessness that makes long-term planning feel pointless. These explanations were not entirely without evidence, but they bothered Mullainathan. Because they were circular, they explained poor decisions by pointing to characteristics of poor people, without ever asking whether the conditions of financial scarcity themselves might be doing something specific to the machinery people use to make decisions in the first place. Mullainathan brought this question to Shafir, whose research in cognitive psychology had focused on the mechanics of how the human mind handles competing demands on its attention. Together, they designed a series of experiments that would test a very different hypothesis. Not that poor people are different kinds of thinkers, but that the state of financial worry itself occupies cognitive resources so thoroughly that less of those resources remain available for everything else. The first major test of this hypothesis was elegant in its design, and almost implausible in what it revealed. In the Tamil Nadu region of India, sugarcane farmers live through a cycle that provides a near-perfect natural experiment in financial stress. Before the harvest, they are desperately poor. The money from the previous harvest has run out. Bills are difficult to pay. Financial worry is acute and constant. After the harvest, the same farmers receive their annual income in a single large payment. They are, at least temporarily, financially comfortable. The financial problem that consumed their attention for months has, for now, been resolved. Mullainathan, Shafir, and their colleague Anand Mani tested these farmers at both points in the cycle, before harvest and after harvest. Same people. Same villages, same fields, same researchers, same tests of fluid intelligence and working memory. The results were not subtle. The same farmers performed significantly better on cognitive tests after the harvest than before it. The difference was not explained by nutrition, which the researchers carefully controlled for. It was not explained by sleep, which they also measured. The farmers were not eating better or sleeping more after the harvest. They were simply less financially worried. And the cognitive difference that worry made was the equivalent across the sample of approximately 13 to 14 IQ points. The same brain, operating at measurably different capacity, depending on whether it was also simultaneously managing a financial crisis. This is a finding that demands explanation at the level of mechanism, not just observation. What is actually happening inside a mind that is carrying active financial worry? What is consuming that cognitive capacity? And why? The answer comes from a convergence of research in cognitive psychology and neuroscience on a concept called bandwidth. Bandwidth in cognitive science refers to the total processing capacity of working memory and attention at any given moment. It is not fixed in the sense of IQ, which is a rough measure of cognitive potential under neutral conditions. It is fluid, in the sense that the available share of it at any moment depends on how much is already being consumed by other tasks. The technical term for what financial worry does to bandwidth is cognitive load, when the mind is actively managing an unresolved problem. It does not set that problem aside cleanly when other tasks arrive. It continues to run the problem in a background process, cycling through it repeatedly, returning to it between other demands, checking it, reframing it, running calculations. The psychological term for this is intrusive cognition, and research on intrusive cognition across multiple domains has consistently shown that it is not free. It draws on the same cognitive resources that conscious, deliberate thinking uses. The prefrontal cortex, which is the brain region responsible for working memory, planning, impulse control, and flexible reasoning, is not capable of separating financial background worry from foreground cognitive tasks in any clean way. Both compete for the same neural real estate. Both draw on the same attentional reserves. A mind that is simultaneously managing a financial crisis and attempting to make a complex decision is not a mind multitasking efficiently. It is a mind with reduced functional capacity applied to the decision at hand. Shafir and Mullainathan tested this mechanism more directly in their second major experiment, conducted in a shopping mall in New Jersey. Mall visitors were randomly assigned to one of two conditions. In the easy money condition, they were told to imagine that their car had broken down and the repair would cost $150. Easy, manageable. Nothing to worry about. In the hard money condition, they were told to imagine the same car breakdown, but this time the repair would cost $1,500. A genuinely difficult financial problem. Plausible enough to engage real cognitive attention after visualizing their assigned scenario for a few moments. Both groups were given a battery of cognitive tests measuring fluid intelligence and working memory. Among participants who described themselves as financially comfortable, there was no meaningful difference in performance between the two conditions. A $1,500 car repair was stressful to think about, but it did not materially impair their cognitive function, because they had enough financial slack in their lives that even a difficult scenario did not fully engage their financial threat detection system. Among participants who described themselves as financially constrained, the results were dramatically different. Those in the easy condition performed comparably to the financially comfortable group. Those in the hard condition, simply by spending a few moments imagining a plausible and stressful financial problem, showed a significant drop in cognitive performance equivalent to approximately 13 IQ points. Same people, different cognitive capacity, depending on whether a financial threat was active in their minds. This is where the finding starts to become not just interesting, but structurally important, because it reveals something that the standard narratives about financial struggle almost entirely miss. The decisions that financially constrained people are required to make are, on average, more cognitively demanding than the decisions financially comfortable people face, not less. More. A person with financial slack can make a bad financial decision without compounding consequences. They can pay a slightly higher interest rate on a credit card, forget a bill, miss an investment opportunity, and absorb the cost without catastrophe. Their decision-making environment has what Mullainathan and Shafir call slack, buffer space that converts small errors into minor inconveniences rather than cascading crises. A person without financial slack faces decisions where errors compound directly and immediately. The difference between paying a bill this week or next week may determine whether late fees trigger an overdraft. That triggers more fees. That eliminates the ability to pay another bill. Each financial decision is nested inside a structure where the cost of error is high and the margin for recovery is thin. These are precisely the conditions that activate the cognitive load effect most powerfully. The higher the stakes of a financial decision, the more cognitive bandwidth the worry about that decision consumes. And the more bandwidth it consumes. And the more bandwidth it consumes. The less remains for making the decision well. The system is, in this sense, self-reinforcing. The people who most need their full cognitive capacity to navigate complex financial decisions are the people whose financial situation is most likely to be consuming that capacity in the first place. This is not a metaphor. It is a measurable physiological mechanism, with documented behavioral consequences. One of the most important behavioral consequences is something Mullainathan and Shafir call tunneling. When the mind is in a state of genuine scarcity, whether of money, time, food, or social connection, it exhibits a characteristic attentional pattern. It narrows. It focuses intensely on whatever the scarcity is pressing most immediately. It filters out information, options, and considerations that fall outside the narrow field of immediate urgency. This narrowing produces what researchers call a focusing dividend. Within the tunnel, the mind is actually sharper and more effective at solving the immediate problem it is focused on. A person in acute financial crisis becomes remarkably resourceful at solving the specific cash flow problem directly in front of them. But the tunnel has walls, and everything outside the tunnel, including information, options, and opportunities that would be obvious from a wider view, becomes effectively invisible. The financially constrained person who discovers a payday lender offering an emergency loan is focused inside the tunnel on the immediate problem the loan solves. The annualized interest rate of 300% or more that makes the loan destructive in the medium term falls outside the tunnel, not because the person is incapable of understanding interest rates, but because the cognitive bandwidth required to step outside the tunnel, calculate the compounding cost, and compare it against alternative strategies, is not available, because that same bandwidth is already fully occupied by the immediate financial pressure that created the tunnel in the first place. This is the mechanism that explains a pattern that has puzzled researchers and policymakers for decades. Why do financially constrained people sometimes make financial decisions that seem to make their situation worse? The answer, Mohanathan and Shafir's work suggests, is not character. It is not culture. It is not education. It is bandwidth. The cognitive resources required to make a better decision are being consumed by the very conditions that make a better decision necessary. Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia, in a separate but related line of research on adaptive unconscious processing, has documented how thoroughly the mind manages ongoing unresolved concerns in the background of awareness. The more urgent and unresolved an emotional or practical concern, the more cognitive resources it commands in background processing, and the more those resources are unavailable for foreground tasks. Financial worry scores near the top of the list because money is implicated in almost every domain of daily life simultaneously, making the worry recursive and difficult to set aside. What the scarcity research adds is the quantification. The cognitive impairment that results from this background processing is not subjective or metaphorical. It is measurable. It fluctuates, and it fluctuates with the financial situation, not with the person. This last point is the one that carries the most weight. The impairment is not a stable trait of people who grew up in financial hardship. It is a state, and states can change. The most direct evidence for this comes from a series of cash transfer studies conducted in Kenya, Brazil, India, and Indonesia over the past decade. In these programs, low-income households received unconditional cash transfers, money given without requirements about how it must be spent or what behaviors must be changed in exchange. Researchers then measured cognitive performance. The pattern was consistent and striking. Recipients showed measurable improvements in cognitive test performance, improvements in impulse control, reductions in stress hormone levels, and reductions in the kinds of financially costly decision-making errors that the scarcity research predicts would be produced by bandwidth depletion. These were not improvements driven by financial education. Recipients did not receive lessons on budgeting or investment. They received money, and the money, by reducing the acute financial pressure that was consuming cognitive bandwidth, restored cognitive capacity that was already there. The brain had not been damaged. It had been occupied. Occupation, unlike damage, responds to relief. A 2019 study by researchers at Carnegie Mellon and Harvard found that participants who were helped to automate their savings, taking the recurring decision of whether to save off the conscious cognitive agenda entirely, showed not just increased savings rates, but measurable improvements in subsequent unrelated decision-making performance. Removing the recurring financial decision from the active cognitive workload freed bandwidth for other tasks. You cannot easily think your way out of a cognitive state caused by the very conditions that you need clearer thinking to address. This is not a paradox. It is a physiological constraint, and recognizing it as such shifts the question from what is wrong with people in financial hardship to what is the cognitive cost of the conditions they are navigating, and how do those conditions change what kinds of support are actually useful. This is also where the scarcity research reconnects with the broader body of work on financial behavior. The money scripts absorbed in childhood, the cortisol systems calibrated by early caregiving, the somatic markers laid down by first experiences with financial fear, these do not operate in isolation. They operate inside a present-day cognitive system whose available bandwidth is being continuously shaped by present-day financial conditions. A person carrying both a childhood-installed money script and an active financial stress load is not facing one obstacle. They are facing two, and the second one reduces their capacity to address the first. This is why the experience of financial struggle so often feels like more than the sum of its economic parts. It is. The cognitive cost of financial scarcity is real. It is measurable. In his compounds every other challenge the mind is attempting to manage at the same time. Mullainathan described this in a lecture at MIT several years after the original paper. He said that the standard policy response to financial struggle tends to assume that what people need is more information, more education, more motivation, more discipline. But the research suggests something different. What people in financial scarcity often need first is cognitive relief. A reduction in the ambient load of financial worry that allows the bandwidth already present in every one of them to become accessible again. He gave an example that has stayed in public discourse ever since. If you take a highly competent, highly intelligent professional and put them in conditions of genuine, unrelenting financial stress for 6 months, you will see measurable declines in their cognitive performance, their decision quality, their impulse control, and their ability to plan ahead. Not because they became less intelligent, because their intelligence became occupied. And if you then resolve the financial pressure, the cognition returns. The same brain, the same person, measurably different performance, depending on what it is required to carry. That is the finding. Not that poverty makes people less intelligent, that financial worry consumes the intelligence people already have, and that the consumption is not uniform, it is not fair. It falls most heavily on the people who are already navigating the most complex, the most high stakes, and the most unforgiving financial terrain. The next time you are looking at a financial decision, and you find yourself struggling to think clearly, struggling to see the full picture, struggling to hold competing considerations in mind at once, it is worth asking a question that has nothing to do with your intelligence, your education, or your character. It is worth asking how much of your bandwidth is already in use. Because the answer to that question tells you something that a budget spreadsheet never will. It tells you the actual cognitive conditions inside which every financial decision you make is taking place. And it tells you that improving those conditions is not a luxury reserved for people who have already solved their financial problems. It is, according to the science, one of the most direct paths available to making better ones. The 13 IQ points are not gone, they are occupied. And occupation, unlike damage, can be relieved.